welcome to another episode of Forgotten Uniques. In this series I'm covering unique items in Path of Exile that aren't used very much, if at all, taking a look at how they function and how their mechanics interact with other parts of the game, especially any recent additions such as Ascendancy changes or new unique items. This video is all about Kongming's Stratagem, a unique shield which is a tier 4 global drop, so it's quite common and farmable even in SSF, and especially with the existence of the Genesis tree, which can be used to target farm uniques. Speaking of the Genesis tree, there's also a Foulborn version of this item, which is quite good, and we'll get to that a bit later in this video. Now, I've actually wanted to cover this unique in this series since the original set of videos almost 2 years ago, but I never quite got around to doing it, so I'm getting to it now. Kongming's Stratagem is not a recent unique addition to Path of Exile. In fact, it was added all the way back in patch 2.1 over 10 years ago, and even beyond that, the item hasn't received much in the way of any adjustments or balance changes over the years. It's actually barely changed at all. Despite this though, for me, this is the epitome of interesting unique item design in Path of Exile, and even without buffs or improvements, a Miracle was able to make great use of this unique in a Valdo map farmer back in patch 3.25, more on that in a little while. So let's take a look at the modifiers on Kongming's Stratagem. This is an ancient spirit shield, so it has a small increased spell damage implicit, and it's a low level intelligence shield base, so the lack of base energy shield is made up for by a large increased energy shield explicit modifier, and with quality this can provide over 200 energy shield, which is not bad at all considering the other modifiers on this item. Then we have a triggered spell on here, trigger level 20, Fog of War when your trap is triggered. So a bit of a bonus for making use of trap skills when using this item, and this skill ties into the overall theme of the shield, which is all about blinding your enemies and benefiting from that blind debuff in more ways than just the debuff itself. Fog of War creates multiple smoke clouds on the ground at the location of the triggered trap, and enemies within those clouds will be blinded. The spell has a base cooldown of 1 second, and the clouds themselves have a base duration of 3 seconds, so when using traps on single target, you can fairly reliably maintain blind on that target with this method of application, but for a more open setting like mapping or larger boss arenas with multiple enemies, it's not quite as reliable, and if you're making use of this shield, you will absolutely want to ensure you can maintain blind, especially on dangerous enemies. We'll get to more on that in just a moment. First, let's briefly discuss blind. This is a debuff that imposes 20% less accuracy rating and 20% less evasion rating, and can be scaled with modifiers to blind effect. The most efficient use of this debuff is on a character that uses evasion defensively and accuracy offensively, as the debuff being present on your enemies would essentially improve the effectiveness of those stats, with a higher chance to evade against the lower accuracy rating of the enemy, and an improved chance to hit with attacks against the lower evasion rating of the enemy. With that said though, blind is a great debuff to pair with some evasion scaling alone, even on a hybrid build. Next, there's a moderate roll of intelligence here, about the equivalent of a tier 5 or 6 modifier, and there's also an increased damage modifier here with hits and ailments against blinded enemies, but it is limited to fire damage specifically. Okay, now we've reached the two really interesting modifiers on this item. 30% reduced spell damage taken from blinded enemies, and no chance to block. Let's discuss that second modifier first, no chance to block. This is not to be confused with a similar modifier, cannot block, which exists on another unique shield, the Eternal Apple. No chance to block is different, because it doesn't actually prevent your character from being able to block, rather it simply removes the base chance to block from this ancient spirit shield base, which usually has a 24% base attack block chance, and so it no longer has any on this unique variant of the item. That means that you can still utilize defensive blocking on your character if you want to, it will just require considerably higher investment to do so. However, there is one really important modifier that must be mentioned here, and that's one that exists on the Gladiator's Determined Survivor Ascendancy Notable, or the Scion's Ascendant Gladiator Ascendancy option. Gain 50% chance to block from equipped shield instead of shield's value. Because the no chance to block modifier on Kongming Stratagem doesn't actually prevent you from blocking, you can make use of these modifiers to gain 50% attack block chance from a shield that would normally provide no base block chance, making it one of the prime use case options for this shield, allowing you to scale both block and evasion at the same time as avoidance layers for incoming attacks. Now, Kongming Stratagem has one final modifier, and it's the most important one on this item. 30% reduced spell damage taken from blinded enemies. So this is another modifier that benefits from blinded enemies. Note that this is reduced spell damage taken, so whilst it is very similar to spell suppression, there are a few key differences. Firstly, spell suppression provides a base 40% mitigation against incoming spells, and it also works to lessen the damage of any ailments that are applied to you from those spell hits, unlike this modifier on Kongming Stratagem, which only extends its damage reduction to spell damage specifically. However, spell suppression is a less damage taken modifier, meaning it's multiplicative with other forms of damage reduction that would apply to the same incoming damage. But the modifier on this unique shield is a reduced damage taken modifier, meaning it's additive with any other applicable damage taken modifiers. For example, the Pantheon power upgrades for both the Soul of Lunaris and the Soul of Solaris that provide reduced elemental damage taken if you have or haven't been hit recently. These would apply additively with the reduced damage taken modifier on Kongming Stratagem if the incoming spell damage dealt elemental damage and the prerequisites were satisfied. Another example is the Wise Oak, a unique flask that can grant reduced damage taken of specific elemental types based on your resistances, and once again, this would stack additively with Kongming's reduced spell damage taken modifier. So as an example, a character using Kongming Stratagem, the Soul of Lunaris Pantheon power, and the Wise Oak unique flask, who has been hit recently and has their lowest uncapped resistance as their cold resistance, would take 42% reduced damage from incoming cold damage spell hits, as long as the enemy was blinded. That's a huge extra layer of mitigation when you consider that you'll still have access to your basic resistances to reduce that damage first, and potentially spell suppression as well, not to mention other layers of mitigation. However, these are just some examples of modifiers that you could combine with Kongming Stratagem, and there's actually one very specific ascendancy notable that must be discussed here because of its incredible synergy with this unique shield, and that's the Saboteurs Born in the Shadows. Cannot be blinded, blind enemies on hit, 15% reduced damage taken from blinded enemies, and nearby enemies are blinded. So this is a way to ensure that you can hit and apply blind to enemies that are far away from you, but you also essentially have a blinding aura in a 3.5 meter radius around you, maintaining this debuff on any enemies caught within. These modifiers alone would provide great synergy, but there's also another damage taken modifier on here that once again stacks additively with Kongming Stratagem, and this will result in taking 45% reduced spell damage from blinded enemies, which, simply put, is an incredibly powerful mitigation layer to have access to. Keep in mind that you don't even need to be a Saboteur to make use of Born in the Shadows. You can use Flesh and Flame Jewels to utilize this notable on a Trickster or an Assassin, which is exactly what A Miracle did back in patch 3.25 on a Trickster, on a near-immortal build designed to farm Void Valdo maps. A Miracle used this blind tech together with pre-nerf spell suppression and maximum resistance scaling amongst other things to create a ridiculously tanky character, and I'll link A Miracle's video on that build in the description below if you're interested. Now, whilst this unique shield hasn't really been updated much in the years that it's been available in Path of Exile, one currency addition in the most recent league, 3.28 Mirage, has impacted the potential of this unique like many others, and that's the Volatile Vaal Orb. This item corrupts a unique with a 50% chance of destroying it, before divining its modifiers and applying a magnitude scaling multiplier of between 0.78 and 1.22, and the end result is also rounded to the nearest whole number, which would mean that a perfect Volatile Vaal Orb outcome of a 1.22 multiplier would result in a 37% reduced spell damage taken modifier after rounding, which is quite powerful to say the least. And speaking of powerful, earlier in the video I mentioned the existence of a Foulborn version of this unique, and here it is. The increased fire damage modifier is replaced with enemies blinded by you have 100% reduced critical strike chance. Now, whilst the increased damage modifier can be useful, it's quite niche in only applying to fire damage, but the Foulborn version of this item removes the offensive modifier and replaces it with another defensive boost. And this one is actually really quite good, especially if you're unable to invest into incoming crit mitigation elsewhere. Importantly, if a blinded enemy has no source of increased critical strike chance, then this modifier will reduce their base critical strike chance to 0, so it's actually quite effective in pinnacle boss arenas, for example. However, if an enemy does have increased critical strike chance, such as from a rare monster modifier like the Precision Aura that grants 100% increased critical strike chance, then these would stack additively, thus cancelling each other out, resulting in a normal critical strike chance for those affected enemies. Regardless, this is still quite a strong modifier, and I'd say that it's generally a bit more useful than the increased fire damage one on most builds. Okay, so is Kongming's Stratagem really a forgotten unique? Well, it's a bit less forgotten than the last unique we had in this series, which was the Selfish Shepherd, as there are a total of 29 characters using this shield or its Foulborn version in the Mirage League, but it's not an item that has seen much use of late. Like many uniques, this one has struggled to keep up with the power creep of crafted gear over many leagues, but Kongming's Stratagem does offer some extremely strong defenses in the correct setups, defensive layering that you can't really obtain elsewhere, and this combined with the design of this item is what makes it truly unique for me. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.